In the first letter of St. Peter, he tells us that we are to be holy even as God is holy. He's basically quoting from Leviticus, where God told Moses the same thing, that the Israelites should be holy as he is because he is holy. But that raises a question. What really is holiness? I don't think that holiness is slavishly following a set of rules. That's kind of what the Pharisees did, and Jesus condemned it. And if you go to the Catechism, there really isn't a definition of holiness. The Catechism talks a lot about the church being holy and how we are called to be holy, but I didn't really see any place where it defines what holiness is. I went to a website and I found this definition. Holiness is our strength to be set apart for the service of God. And that's good, but I think that's just a beginning, because I think we're called to be more than just set apart. I think there's a holiness. To be holy is, I think there's an activity that we're supposed to be doing. And if you read the New Testament, Jesus never says, be holy as I am holy. He says, love one another as I have loved you. And so for Jesus, the love seems to be the holiness that we're called to. But the question is, love is one of those words in English that has all kinds of meanings. We love our dog, we love the car that we've got, we love shoes, we love a football team, baseball team, whatever it is. But that really isn't the kind of love that Jesus, I think, is talking about. I think the Greeks had it right. They had several words for love. One that comes to mind, of course, is eros, erotic love. There was also philia, which was brotherly love. There was storge, which was familial love. And then some people have defined, there's a Greek word called mania, which is obsessive love. And then there was another love that was philautia, which is self-love. None of those really are the loves that Jesus was calling us to. The love that Jesus is calling us to is agape. And agape is selfless love. And this is the love, when St. John says, God is love, that's the love that he's referring to, this selfless love. And so in order to understand what Jesus is calling us to, this love, this holiness, I think it's helpful to read St. Angela of Foligno. St. Angela lived in the 1200s. She died in about 1309. She was born into a wealthy family. She had all the trappings of wealth of the time. She got married, had some kids, lived I don't know if it was a lavish life, but a very comfortable life at least, and was very social and all of that. But she was prayerful, and when she was about 40, she had a vision of St. Francis, and St. Francis was calling her to a holiness, the term that comes around, self-abnegation, denial, that she should give things away in order to follow God. And she did a little of that, but then soon after that, her mother died, and then her husband died, and then her children died. And she started to reflect further on what St. Francis had said, and she felt that God was calling her to give things up. And so she started giving away all the trappings of luxury that she lived with. She did keep a servant who assisted her, but she basically was giving things to the poor and began this very devout life. And she gathered there were some women gathered around her. They formed a community, and she was working on trying to follow the Franciscan way. She became a third order Franciscan, a lay Franciscan, and she became recognized for her intelligence and her prayer, and was very highly regarded by theologians at the time. But she had an observation. She said that Jesus suffered, that he sacrificed even with the incarnation, even becoming man. And here's the thought. So God the Father, this is my understanding of the Trinity, which I know isn't perfect, but I've mentioned it to other people, other priests and theologians, and they haven't told me I was totally wrong. So you and I, we have an image in our head of what we look like, of who we are. Usually it's, we're young and handsome, and we have hair, and charming, witty, all that kind of stuff. But it's not true what we have, our image. But God also has an image of himself in his mind. But he's God, he's perfect. And so that image is perfectly him. He's also the most beautiful, wonderful, marvelous being in all of existence. In fact, he is the root of all being. And he has this image in his head. Now he's God, all-powerful. And so that image actually became a person, Jesus, the second person of the Trinity. And Jesus, the Christ, loved the Father, and the Father loved Christ so much and so powerfully that love became a person, the Holy Spirit. And so this triune God is all tied up in this immense, this powerful love. I think of it as a furnace of love. There's just this burning community of love, surrounded by a myriad of angels, countless angels, all praising him and glorifying him. And it's a perfect, wonderful, blissful existence for Jesus. But as St. Paul tells us, Jesus emptied himself of that divinity. He emptied himself not of the divinity, I was corrected on that. He emptied himself, and the way I understand it, he's emptied himself of all that glory. And he was incarnate of the Virgin Mary and was born into a simple, if not even a poor family. He grew up in Nazareth in obscurity, and I'm going to talk about this in a future podcast, but later when he goes back to Nazareth and after he begins his ministry, the people there are incredulous. They say, "Who is this guy? He was a carpenter. Why is he teaching this? How is he doing these miracles?" They didn't believe him because when Jesus grew up, he grew up very simply and quietly and humbly, and he was obedient to Mary and Joseph. So it wasn't like he was, it's not a real gospel. But there is the proto-evangelium of James. That's a mouthful. And it talks about when Jesus was a kid and he performed miracles and stuff, and, turned, I think it was rocks into birds and all that kind of stuff. And all of that was made up. None of it had anything to do with what really happened. But so Jesus grew up basically in obscurity. He began his ministry, and he gathered some followers around him, and his followers didn't get it. They were confused, and they didn't understand where he was coming from, what he wanted of them. So he had this following, and it must have been very frustrating to him. He was betrayed by one of those followers, a friend. He was condemned by the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees and Sadducees, who were the leaders of his Jewish community. He was turned over to the Romans and suffered a humiliating death. When we see Jesus hanging on the cross, he's covered up, but he was naked and painful. The spikes being driven into his hands and feet, the beating that he took, the crown of thorns, painful and humiliating death. And he gained nothing for that. He did it totally for us so that we could be with him in heaven forever. That's the kind of selfless love that God is calling us to. That's what holiness is all about. And if we think about it, if we loved selflessly, if we try to accomplish this holiness that God is calling us to, this would be a tremendous and if you think about it, if we actually tried to live a holy life, to love selflessly, that would solve a lot of problems. There would probably be little or no basis for divorce. Theft, people would be generous and share, so there would be no need for thieves to go out and steal. Adultery, we'd understand that adultery is hurting other people, and it's a very selfish act. We would understand that war was unnecessary because if we love selflessly, we wouldn't find it necessary to go to war. War is always based on accumulating things, getting power, getting more wealth, suppressing other people. So if we loved selflessly, I think that a lot of our problems would go away. And I think that this selfless love is something that you and I can do on a day-to-day basis. It's very difficult. And also, this selfless love is, it's difficult to really discern sometimes when we are being narcissists. And I think that self-love, that narcissism, it hides in a lot of things that we do. There are people out there who do wonderful things. I remember reading the story about a woman who had gone to a South American country. She was a doctor and she was volunteering all of her time. And I had this nagging thought in my head that nobody is that altruistic, that there must have been something there that was fulfilling a need in her. And so I'm not sure that was, it might have been, but it made me wonder about whether or not she, and so many other things that people do, we hold it up saying, oh, look how wonderful they are. I think getting to the point where we love selflessly is a challenge, a day-to-day challenge. And I think that we have to pray about it and work at it, really work at it. So St. Peter tells us that we are to be holy even as God is holy. Jesus says that we are to love one another as he has loved us. So being holiness is this selfless love. God bless.